Greetings YouTubers, today I will be discussing what else? Overwatch. Since this is a game that is all about different characters with different playstyles, I thought it would make sense to go over each hero currently in the roster and give my analysis. It's worth mentioning that while I am biased because I simply haven't played every hero to an equal degree of skill, time, or enjoyment, and I cannot promise an equal amount of information on each, I can promise you that I will not feed you bullshit on the objective stuff. While the Overwatch website and YouTube channel provide a healthy amount of presentation on each hero's abilities and backstory, you really have no idea how any of them will perform until you do so with and against other heroes competitively. I was originally going to make this one long video, but it would end up being in the ballpark of a half hour, and I simply don't have the hard drive space for all that raw footage. Plus, most people probably don't want to watch a video that's that long. Instead, I will be breaking it up into 4 videos covering each class. This will be easier to digest and useful for comparison. While I like to play every hero, I most often play a tank, so I'll be starting with them as I happen to gather enough footage for them first. First, a disclaimer. Because this is a beta, Blizzard is going to be making ongoing changes to hero mechanics and balance. Much has already been changed since the last version of the beta, and more adjustments are likely coming in the future. Overall, my commentary here should remain valid unless they do a major rework of any hero. At any rate, I will not be focusing on hero abilities in this video, as the Overwatch website already gives a decent overview and explanation of the basics. Instead, I will be focusing broadly on relative strengths and weaknesses, as well as balance and where everyone fits at this point in development. Long story short, anything I say in here may be subject to change at Blizzard's discretion, and I will keep you appraised where necessary. For most of you, this should go without saying. Before I begin, I also want to mention that you'll hear me talk about the concept of threat. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept of threat mechanics in the context of an MMORPG, where an NPC follows a table of threat generated to govern which player should be attacked at any given point in time. However, I have found that this concept can very much apply to a PvP setting, whereby the battlefield presence of certain characters is more threatening to the enemy team than others, due to things like relative size, noise generated, DPS, disruptive abilities, crowd control, etc. The amount of threat a particular hero generates does not translate to anything directly, other than the tendency for enemy players to focus on that hero over others. I have found that this is an important thing to keep in mind in order to get the most out of whichever hero you are playing. I'm really pleased with the way that Blizzard has implemented the concept of a tank into what is ostensibly a first-person shooter. A tank's job, for those of you unaware, is to get in the enemy's face, disrupt them, and soak up damage for their team. One thing all tanks have in common is they are high-threat characters, and rightfully so. Tanks force you to deal with them or suffer the consequences, usually death or at the very least, disarray. Playing a tank relies on aggressive play, but also with a keen eye to strategy. Knowing when to hurl yourself at the enemy and when to hold back is key. Being in the middle of things and disrupting the enemy team can be super effective, but running in and dying by yourself will leave your team without much needed damage soak. And MMO veterans know well how precarious that situation will be. And much like in MMO, tanks function as de facto raid leaders, and should be rallied around and supported whenever possible. One of the most recent additions to the Overwatch roster is D.Va. She is an interesting hero. Unlike the other tanks who utilize some kind of shield or healing for self-sustain, she survives by being purely a bullet sponge with the highest base armor in the game. Upon death, instead of actually dying, she jumps out of her mech and continues on foot until a new mech can be warped in. During this time, she cannot function as a tank, but can still put a surprising amount of damage on enemies from a distance. Her ultimate takes the longest to charge up, but is the most powerful in game for burst damage and point clearing. Picking the right time and location to use it will make all the difference, as you will likely only get one per checkpoint. She is also the most mobile of all the tanks, allowing her to become a real nuisance when used properly. When engaging her, remember that she never has to reload, and her primary fire can deal considerable damage to large targets such as Reinhardt and Winston. Use her defensive matrix to intercept enemy ultimates and other high damage projectiles to protect yourself and your team. I've nothing really to say about balance with her at this time. I think she's a strong addition to the roster given how different her playstyle is from the other tanks. She can also be a must-have counter when a defense is dug in due to the range of damage of her self-destruct. Now for my personal favorite of the current roster, Reinhardt. He is arguably the strongest tank in the game because of his versatility and the sheer amount of damage he can mitigate. His shield absorbs up to 2,000 damage and recharges fairly quickly when not being used. It is important to remember that allies can shoot through it, providing mobile cover, but enemies can also walk through it, making you vulnerable to characters like Reaper and McCree. The key to playing Reinhardt well is knowing when to get in the enemy's face and when to hold back and protect your team. He is slow, and makes more noise than any other character when moving around, so getting behind the enemy can be difficult but extremely powerful. Use your charge to break through the enemy lines and remove a piece from the board, then spin around and put up your shield. This forces the enemy team to deal with you, facing their backs to the rest of your team. If your allies are paying attention, it should be an easy cleanup. If not, well, at least you went down like a boss. His Fire Strike does a decent amount of damage, goes through barriers, has a large particle size, a short cooldown, and as far as I can tell, infinite range. Use it to put pressure on enemies and choke points and finish off weakened opponents. His ultimate has a fair amount of forward range but covers a narrow arc, so wait for the enemy team to group up and get play of the game with minimal effort. Reinhardt was arguably overpowered in the last version of the beta, but with so many increases to damage outputs on other heroes in this version, his survivability has noticeably decreased. He did receive a nerf to his ultimate, reducing damage and whip, but on the whole I think this is fair, given that it was designed to be a setup move rather than a finisher. My only problem with his balance at this point is I think he could use some more armor. 500 HP is good, but if maybe another 50 of it were armor, it would help him main tank against the noticeable uptake in DPS coming from other classes. Reinhardt doesn't just wield a hammer, he is a hammer. He is slow, and taking him out of the picture means a reasonable amount of time before he is back in the game. Use this to your advantage when engaging a team with a skilled tank. As for right now, he is the top choice of tank at competitive levels. Next we come to Roadhog. Roadhog is most comparable to Stitches from Heroes of the Storm, and he is extremely powerful in the right hands. He has a bit of a learning curve due to his short range and chain mechanics, but by far the highest survivability. He is a solid choice for a main tank when needing to counter a Pharah or a Bastion. His main weakness here, however, is the lack of any sort of shield. He can keep himself alive pretty well, but can do very little to mitigate damage on allies. For this reason, he synergizes well with a Zarya or a Winston. His ultimate is also around the highest DPS in-game within its effective range, and among the most powerful for point clearing. Given the knockback mechanic, it can be near impossible to deal with. The key is to use it when your enemies are caught out in the open, such as when capturing an objective. In the last version of the beta, I felt his survivability was way too high given his damage and self-sustain, but recent buffs to DPS classes have leveled him out. Overall, I think he is in a good place. After Roadhog comes my favorite character conceptually speaking, Winston. Winston is a little different than the other tanks in that what he lacks in direct damage mitigation he makes up for in mobility. While he is still less mobile than D.Va, he is better at locking down positions and harassing the backline, which is his primary job. For this reason, Winston can be a bit weak as a main tank, but exceptionally strong as an off tank. Go after snipers, healers, teleporters, and turrets. If you do your job right, the enemy team will never have a backline to speak of. While Winston can be extremely powerful in certain situations, he is a bit weak overall in my opinion. In pre-beta versions of the game, he had 600 HP. In this version, only 500, and less armor than Reinhardt. He also does very little DPS, which is fine for harassing snipers and whatnot, but given his character concept, I think he should have a little more survivability. I recommend giving him a longer shield duration, with the same strength, either more HP or more armor, and possibly a little more damage to his ultimate. While the primary goal of him and his ult is disruption, not damage, it can be difficult to do your job when certain heroes can simply ignore you. His shield absorbs a reasonable amount of damage, but has a short duration relative to the cooldown, so I'd really like to see a buff there. Although I feel less strongly about this lately, which may mean that Blizzard has already done this, but they have a bad habit of making small changes without being explicit in the patch notes. Since the beta started up again, there have been at least 2 hotfixes without any indication of what was done specifically. With a little more survivability, Winston will gain a lot more versatility, which will mean more diversity in the meta later on.
I sense a pattern developing.
Last of the tanks is Zarya. Zarya has a lower health pool than the other tanks, but half of it is a shield, giving her the best short-term recovery. She has a lot of versatility and synergizes well with most team comps. Her secondary fire works similar to a grenade launcher, and is key to putting damage on enemies, so she functions best with a height advantage. Be sure to time her self-shield correctly to maximize the damage absorbed, as its duration is very short. If an enemy breaks the shield, that's 50 charge. Use your E on a teammate on the front line and get another 50 charge from that. Maximum charge on Zarya is extremely dangerous, and makes short work of most heroes. Her ultimate is also one of the best for synergizing with other ults. Pull the enemy team together and let a Pharah, Soldier 76, or other team killer do the rest. If you have maximum charge, you can even take out most of the team yourself. Engaging a skilled Zarya one-on-one is usually a bad idea. Her main weakness is her low health pool, as I mentioned earlier, and her range, so focusing her from a distance is probably the best way to deal with her. What she lacks in survivability she makes up for in being able to suppress the enemy team with decent damage, so I think she is in a good place balance-wise. Her mechanics also make her exceptionally strong on the new King of the Hill style maps. She is akin to a gladiator who thrives on constant engagement and can maintain major zone presence with a little support. So I hope you found this overview useful, especially if your experience with the game is limited. I will be working on the other 3 parts over the next week or so. Really all depends on how quickly I can gather footage. If you made it this far, thank you for watching and stay tuned.